if anyone's wondering, I'm sharing this to my story. It's a historical event.
Okay, I've just checked the YouTube account and we are currently live. It is working.
Brilliant. Okay, I'll let the committee in general know. Actually, I should be sharing the event picture. Okay, shall we start?
Yeah. Okay.
And
hi.
we are currently live. It is working.
Excellent. Okay, then we will begin. Hi, everyone. Sorry, I thought I was hearing echoes there. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming to our first ever virtual debate on Zoom. We are very excited for this. This is a corresponding debate, so we have speakers here from Edinburgh Union. They're a corresponding society. We do this. We revived this tradition last year during our 250th session, and we're continuing it. And it's actually really useful using Zoom to do this because, you know, you guys don't have to even leave the country. So yeah, thank you so much for coming here, both to the speakers, chair, and also to all our attendees. Hopefully this works. It's our first time trying this, but we're very excited. So with that, I'd like to call upon the chair. I'd like to call upon the chair. We have Naomi O'Leary in the chair tonight.
I call this House to order and call upon the Record Secretary to read the minutes of the last public business meetings.
Well, an Englishman, a Scotsman, and an Irishman walk into a bar. The Englishman wanted to go, so they all had to leave. Seriously though, why do you need a different passport colour? I know it was Theresa May's idea, but having jumped from her ship to Boris's, I'm surprised that the new British foreign travel policy hasn't just become shouting, "I'm British, less of your nonsense," and strolling right through airport security. Like, that would be your ideal scenario, I'm sure, but tough luck, my Scottish friends, because your English compadres are screwing up any chance of that. I mean, Westminster is supposed to be the mother of all parliaments, but they're not really all that responsible, are they? I mean, considering what they did with your country, I wouldn't trust them with ours, particularly how they treat the voters. We want to name the big new boat, Boaty McBoatface. No. We want to break up the EU and trash the world economy. Go ahead. And worst of all, it's going to ruin the Bond movies. So it's just as well for you that Sean Connery isn't allowed to play the great secret agent anymore, since half the movies will be scenes of him stuck in airport security while they scrutinise his passport. If I were you, I'd be furious about the whole Brexit ruining your freedom of travel thing. But then again, Scotland has been putting up with this kind of nonsense since 1707, and you're broke anyway, so how much worse can it get?
I think it's back to the chair. I think you're muted, sorry.
Are there any objections to my signing these minutes as a true and accurate account of the last public business meeting? Possibly we've gone ahead in the order, have we? So should I say the question before the House? The question before the House this evening is, this House believes that the European project has failed. And I should,
I do think we missed the standing orders section, which is where I speak. Apologies for interrupting you there. So very quickly, just to outline the standing orders for this evening's debate, especially considering this is a new form of standing orders than we're used to. Speeches this evening will be 9 minutes in length, with the first and last minute protected. POIs, point of information, may be offered after the first minute. POIs can be offered using the QA function, text only, or by typing POI into the chat to offer a POI aloud. POIs may be offered by opposing speakers or by audience members. We'll also be holding the vote through the Zoom poll. So if you are watching through the YouTube stream and you'd like to have a say as to which side wins, please join our Zoom, our actual Zoom live stream. Finally, we will be having floor speeches if there is interest, but if not, we may not have them. But if you are interested in giving a floor speech, I believe the floor speeches will only be 5 minutes in length, and you can get in contact with Maggie. You can do so through Facebook or through the chat function. And also I'd like to just quickly introduce our guests this evening. As I mentioned, Edinburgh Union is participating in this debate. Great. The Edinburgh Union is the debating society of Edinburgh University and one of the most successful UK debating societies. Speakers are Adam Malice and Alicia Cortenia. Thank you so much for coming. I also would like to introduce the chair, Naomi O'Leary. Naomi is the European correspondent for the Irish Times. As a journalist, she was a former correspondent of Politico Europe and Reuters, and has previously written for The Guardian, The Atlantic, and Huffington Post. O'Leary is the creator of the Irish Passport podcast, which blends Irish current affairs with history and culture, and is one of Ireland's most popular podcasts. She's also the producer and screenwriter for the award-winning 2016 documentary Granite and Chalk. With that, I will pass to the chair to begin the debate, I believe.
Okay, so thank you. The question before the House this evening is, this House believes that the European project has failed. And so I'd now like to call upon Adam Malice to propose the motion to the House.
Madam Chair, audience, the European project was an ambitious project. Previously, nothing of the scale had been attempted in Europe, and it was an attempt to bring Europe towards an ever closer union in the aftermath of not one but two world wars. First of all, let's have what we think this debate is, what we think this debate is about, and how we think each side can win this debate, before I explain why I think that, unfortunately, the European project has failed. Because I think that the European project is broadly an attempt to unify Europe after particularly the Second World War, right? You see its beginnings with Churchill describing a United States of Europe and his vision for that. And then the European project sees, the European Union sees its beginnings traced back to the European coal and steel community, which was broadly an effort for France to tie its trade and industries with Germany's so that war would be virtually and materially impossible, so they could not go to war with each other without sacrificing their economies in such a great way that it would be almost unthinkable for them to do so. And then you see various other states joining and various other unions forming, and eventually you have the EU as it stands now forming in the 90s as a result of this ever closer union. So what do we mean when we say it's failed, right? First of all, note that something that's quite important, which is we're not making a statement on its future in the proposition, right? We're not saying that any state should leave. We're certainly not standing behind Brexit. We're not standing behind the dissolution of the European Union either. We're not making any statement about what should happen in the future of the European Union, as we live in a world where the European Union does exist, and this debate is not about that world. This debate is about whether or not the European project, as it stands, has succeeded or failed in its goals up until this point, and that is the metric by which this debate should be judged. So what do we think this is about, right? We think it's about whether or not it's achieved its goals being peace in the aftermath of the wars, prosperity economically, and upholding its principles in terms of politics and democracy, right? And I think that the stats we stand behind is that it's become a bloated organization that's overzealousness in its goals, going too far too soon, is going to be the instrument of its demise. And that's combined with the extent to which it exploits its poorer Eastern European states is the reason why this European project could have succeeded and ideally should have succeeded, but unfortunately hasn't. First of all, let's talk about it economically, right? Because I think what's important to notice some background here, in that when you compare the European Union as it stands now to as it stands in the early 70s, when you're seeing the beginning of sort of the closer economic ties as we see them now into the European Economic Area, I think note that they had 25% of the world's GDP share in the 70s, and now it's gone down to 15%. I think that the reason for this is because the rest of the world has grown at a rate at which the EU can't match. But note that that's not uniform, right? It's not uniform that the EU has had stagnated growth compared to the rest of the world. It's certain countries within the EU and certain states within the EU that have been utilized and exploited to the benefit of other states. And I think that the reason for this is because there's a monetary union within the EU that is designed to help some states at the expense of others, right? Note that they have a central bank, they have coordinated interest rates, they have this one-size-fits-all monetary policy that is generally dominated by the wealthier countries, such as Germany. I think Germany specifically dominates it because of its trade surplus with the United States of America, right? The US being this global trading superpower that's currently the biggest economy in the world, which means that as Germany has a trade surplus with it, it has quite a lot of economic power in that way. I think you have more power, you have additional power held by the other Western countries that have more money and power to push other countries around and encourage them to vote in ways that they want, either with the carrot or with the stick. They do both. So what does this mean? I think it means that what's happened is you've seen Germany especially, but other countries as well, investing in the south of Europe, investing in Eastern Europe, and giving out loans with incredibly high interest rates that could not be paid back, right? Why do we think that these loans have been accepted then if they're ended up being really bad, as I'm going to tell you? Notice because the governments in these countries are quite short-term, right? They are desperate to win the next election, and to do that, they need to maintain their short-term popularity, often at the expense of the long-term economic prosperity of these nations. So they care about these upcoming elections and less so beyond that, because that is the political time frame and the political turnover and the weight of that turnover at which this happens. And so to the extent these loans give them the ability to spend more money in the short term, I think it makes them look quite popular because they can do things like decrease unemployment, etc. But what happened is that these loans were given out with really high interest rates and they weren't able to be paid back, right? So what this means is that Germany and other countries have had the power to ask for austerity measures to be put in place and ask for various things to be done. I think that the problem here is then that whilst you have the monetary union, you have no fiscal union. This means that you have no overwhelming government that controls taxation throughout the entirety of Europe. That is still left to the individual member states. So you don't have reliable redistribution of wealth between member states, right? So that means that these countries have to pay back their money with interest, but they're not able to depend on increased spending from taxing the wealthier states and redistributing that money to the poorer states to help them do so. They're forced to spend less in these poorer states whilst increasing their taxes so that they can pay back these extortionate loans. What that means on the ground is there's less education, there's less healthcare, there's less welfare, there's increased inequality, and people are stuck in these really negative, detrimental situations where the poor get poorer and the rich get richer. Let's talk about Greece for a bit here. So I think that Greece is quite important. In that, I think that a broad reason why with the Greek crisis there was such a slow recovery and such a problematic recovery is because they were unable to do things like, switch to the drachma and devalue their currency, an alternative strategy that could have benefited them. That's what Germany did in the 40s to try and recover after the Second World War, where they printed a bunch of Deutschmarks. But they were instead stuck with debts going to last them until at the very least 2060 and probably beyond that. So I think, then, if this is so bad and if this strategy that has happened so consistently keeps being so bad, why does it keep happening then? Why do they have the strategy of the beatings will continue until morale improves, so to speak? It's because the EU is undemocratic, right? So even though you have people who want to change it, they can't change it. Consider Portugal, for example. Okay, Portugal particularly hit hard in 2008, and after years of austerity that was causing their economy to continually shrink, the Portuguese courts decided to try and strike down the austerity measures put in place by the EU, and yet the EU Commission pressured the government to ignore these rulings, so they pressed ahead with them, and unsurprisingly, it didn't work too well for them. What's the problem here? The problem is the EU Commission, which is consists of individuals who are nominated by individual states and approved by the EU Council, and finally this full set of 27 commissioners is then either entirely approved or entirely dismissed as a collective by the EU Parliament. The issue here is that then you have this commission that has a vast amount of power, no thank you, and this commission overall has its own incentives and interactions, because they agree to serve the EU as an entity over any of the individual states that chosen to represent. That means that they do that the Portuguese representative doesn't represent Portugal, they represent the European Union. So their intentions are to try and keep the European Union together, to encourage increased European unity, and to serve the EU as it stands, being a Western-dominated organization that prioritizes countries such as France and Germany over Eastern European nations. I think note the irony here, right, which is that the EU has failed to demonstrate the democracy that it swears to uphold as the principle. It is designed specifically to protect that, even going all the way back to World War II, it is designed to protect and uphold these democratic standards. I think in this regard, it's failed in addition to the economic regard, and this is really a source of its own failings. I think there are a couple of other impacts here. First of all, your skepticism, right? That people feel a loss of power within their own countries. They feel like their votes don't matter, and I think that this is broadly why. This is why you see things like Brexit unfortunately happening. It's why the second largest party in France is led by Marine Le Pen. It's why it's a far-right mess. It's why the EU is currently failing to justify its existence, because people don't believe that they have any power over it. They don't see it as a governmental organization or something that they can control. They see it as something that has massive overreach and just massively screwing people over and causing immense economic harm and devastation throughout its member states, but they can't control. It also creates a bizarre disconnect between the European Union and the individual states of the European Union, which has pretty catastrophic consequences. You know that in the 90s, during the Balkans War, it meant that Germany was able to instantly recognize Croatia at the expense of the EU's overall strategy. So what happened is the EU ended up sending the former Yugoslavia into a brutal ethnic civil war that was eventually stopped by not the EU, but NATO. It means that the EU pushes for things like increased closeness with Ukraine, because that's going to benefit the EU as a whole, as its overall entity based on the European Commission, but then that prompts an invasion by Russia, which creates more problems in Ukraine that eventually NATO comes in and mops up. So I think remember this if the opposition tries to tell you about the EU upholding peace after World War II, because that's what it was founded to do. But that's not what it's done. That's what NATO's done. What the EU has done is exploited its eastern member states, and even if you see the benefits in the West, you don't see the benefits anywhere else. I think that's the reason why, unfortunately, the European project has not lived up to what it could have been, and it's failed. That's why we propose. Thank you.
That's back to the chair.
Okay, I'm following my script but it just says that the speeches will proceed. So I guess I'll call, is it the first for the opposition then? Sean Gordon Dalton.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak. In opposition, we believe that the European project has been a great political success. After 3 wars in 70 years, France and Germany are at peace. Portugal, Greece and Spain have been rehabilitated after military rule. Rather than abandon the Eastern Bloc after the collapse of communism left them in ruins, the EU chose to expend considerable political effort and capital to help them rebuild. The EU has played an important role in facilitating peace in Northern Ireland, with rights enshrined in the Good Friday Agreement and the end of all internal border checks. Now, some of our British friends view the EU as a failed foreign economic bureaucracy whose rules have been imposed on their island nation. This is understandable, but not since 1066 has the UK had to suffer the miserable experiences of dictatorship, foreign invasion, and oppressive rule. One could say, ye perfected it. These apprehensions about a successful Europe have spooked those on the other side of the Irish Sea, translating into the disastrous Brexit process. Now, for the last several years, the UK has been consumed with antagonistic negotiations, the ever-present worries of Scottish secession, and Northern Ireland's complex peace, guaranteed by an EU-recognised Anglo-Irish treaty. And the UK will be consumed with the worries for many years to come. Westminster will have to write new legislation on farm subsidies, sanctions, guidelines, customs procedures, employment rights, and the environment. Transposing EU regulations into domestic law will require at least 80,000 pages of documents to be read, discussed, and debated by politicians and civil servants. For a significant portion of people's lifetimes, Brexit will be a continuous chronic feature, because all the while this childish charade of returning to the former glory of empire has been going on, the UK is instead failing. Every hour spent by Number 10 liaising with their spin doctors in the UK press, there are children going hungry, families slipping further into poverty, predatory banks and funds booting people out of their homes and onto the streets. Immigrants and people of colour are being targeted, attacked, and living in fear at the threat of deportation. The very people who rebuilt the UK after devastating wars, who contribute with every measly paycheck to the National Kitty Fund that is supposed to protect them, to protect that gutted NHS, and to protect struggling families, hungry children, refugees, and those suffering and in need. And in this last week, we hear that Boris is planning to break international law and jeopardise the hard-won fragile peace on this island, so he can get some nice coverage from the Telegraph and the Daily Express. There's an awful lot of work ahead for the UK government, and all at the expense of their domestic agenda on health, education, prison reform, infrastructure, and welfare policies. Every hour spent on Brexit is an hour less on pressing domestic policy. The UK might find managing exit from the EU easier than managing the country it's supposed to govern. But this debate, and I'm sorry, is not about the EU, sorry, not about the UK, it's about the EU. I think highlighted against such a travesty of governance and basic human decency, it only proves just how successful the European project has been. In recent years, the European Union has grappled with various crises, which some saw as proof of its vulnerability to existential threats. As it is with every crisis, there are those who benefit from the fallout and others who manage to turn vulnerability into opportunity and strength. The crisis surrounding the EU should be characterized in this way, particularly against the backdrop of right-wing populism. The rise of this anti-European populism has raised many questions, and based on its extreme rhetoric and growing public acceptability, it has naturally been seen as the EU's political nemesis. But in the midst of rising anti-EU movements bent at dislodging and disintegrating the Union, the actions of populist parties have underscored the EU's continuous evolution and transition instead of its disintegration. Rather than succumb to the fear and hate generated by these movements, the EU has used them as fuel to grow that much more successful. The crisis of the European project is not a new phenomenon. Throughout its existence, the European Union has gone from crisis to crisis. They have served as a driving force for its progression, each crisis providing the opportunity to bounce back once a solution has been found. Eastern Europe are the most pro-EU. They are net receivers of financial aid and investment. They certainly don't feel taken advantage of. The euro has helped so many countries, has not in fact helped so many countries at the expense of others. The European project favors an ever closer union, and that is exactly what will help issues surrounding the euro. The financial crash pushed countries around the world to their knees, but with a tie-in to a globally used currency, the pain and suffering was significantly less that would have happened with their own paltry currencies. Weimar Germany, massive inflation. It's true, the Portuguese Commissioner represents the EU and not Portugal, but it is exactly this, the putting aside of petty national squabbles, that have made the EU so successful and what will help the EU avoid the travesty that is awaiting the UK. The EU's single regulatory approach has allowed member states to combine resources. The unified approach to testing and approving and licensing new technologies, medicines, environmental standards, welfare programs, and workplace practices have reduced the duplication of resources at a national government level. The European Union has benefited its citizens by working for peace and prosperity, protecting our basic political, social, and economic rights. As an EU citizen, you're protected against the downsides of globalization by EU support for small businesses and rules to make sure that big companies pay their fair share of tax. A process that will now accelerate since we no longer have the greedy London-based financial services using Westminster as their mouthpiece. Our food and our environment meet some of the highest quality standards in the world. Unscrupulous companies can't get away with selling contaminated food or polluting our rivers and countryside. Enjoy your chlorinated American chicken, because we'll be implementing a European Green New Deal, protecting our planet and its people from climate catastrophe. The EU has also been a leader in promoting human rights, standing up for vulnerable groups, minorities, and the oppressed. Without the UK, the EU can finally work towards implementing an EU-wide programme for aiding refugees, for creating a continental-wide welfare programme. COVID-19 has demonstrated how Europe can come together, overcome political differences to protect the most vulnerable, and it serves as a taster of what an ever closer union can look like. And most importantly, given it was the singular metric by which to judge its success, note that we have peace. Central and Western Europe have never known so long a period without war. The EU is the most successful peace project in human history. It's even got the Nobel Peace Prize. The EU has delivered more than half a century of peace, stability, and prosperity. It's helped raise living standards, and thanks to the abolition of border controls between European countries, people can travel freely throughout most of the continent. All European citizens have the right and freedom to choose in which country they want to study, live, work, or retire. What began as a purely economic union has evolved into an organization spanning a variety of policy areas, from climate, environment, and health to external relations, security, justice, and migration. I want to see it evolve even more. With more powers delegated to the European Parliament, we can have a truly representative European Assembly, directly elected to grow, to bring us closer together. And I'm not the only one. The latest opinion polls regularly confirm this state of mind. European integration is not condemned in principle, but denounced for its lack of results. Even the aforementioned populists have given up on trying to break up the EU in favor of refocusing on its economic aspects. The European Union is just far too popular. The European project is a work in progress. It's well-intended, clumsy, and a mix of notable political successes and some economic failures, but it deserves to succeed. I beg you to oppose.
Thank you very much. I shall now call upon Alva Elizabeth Noonan to propose for the proposition.
Okay, we've heard some excellent arguments about how the European Union is working and is in fact this amazing sort of beacon of peace and also this unifying force. But I want to talk a little bit about the actual structures of the European Union and how, in fact, the European Union and European treaties are often convoluted and bureaucratic, and that actually doesn't help anyone. So firstly, the EU and the European treaties are actually extremely complicated if you look at the overlapping graphs as to which groups belong into which portions, which groups are, say, part of the Schengen zone, which groups are part of various smaller free trade agreements. You have agreements between the Baltic countries, between the Balkan countries, between the Central European countries. There's a lot of different things going on. So while the main European Union does consist of the 27 member states following the UK's departure in January, there are many other treaty areas that include some but not all member states, and some even include non-member states who are forced to abide by the laws of the European Union without actually having a say in what those laws are, which results in a confusing mess of a continent where no one actually understands what exactly is going on. Sorry, I'm trying to manage the technology. Smaller FTA agreements and multinational collaborations within the EU itself between various different states mean that multiple member and non-member states are in confusing alliances among each other and have various duties in addition to contributing to the European Union as an entity. And they have to deal with sort of multiple different governmental bodies and different aims and different focuses. That's why different parts of the EU have various different focuses among themselves. For instance, the Baltic states and the Nordic states have an agreement between themselves to support each other because they're so similar. But the Baltic states' focus on Baltic issues is different to what they would contribute to the European Parliament as a whole, because they have these region-specific entities. And so you get that sort of split between the focus on the local national issues, which are important to the Baltic states, and then the international issues that they can contribute as members of Eastern Europe, as former USSR states, however they're choosing to identify, to the European Parliament as a whole, which is extremely different to the experiences of somewhere like France or Germany or Spain or even the UK and Ireland, who are having, who currently have border issues as well. Not to mention the fact that the EU is pretty bad with outreach and education. From what I've heard, most of what people know is what they found out for themselves from reading different websites or have discovered from watching various news outlets. And while the history of the EU might be taught in some schools, depending on the curriculum you're following and the subjects you take, a lot of people don't actually know a lot about the European Union's history and why it was formed and this emphasis. And I think this lack of clarity in education based around what the EU is exactly, what its history is, what the various entities are, which government bodies do what, means that people are very confused about what they're actually voting for in EU elections and what they're actually contributing to these different governmental bodies. It makes it that sort of lack of clarity and confusion also makes it much easier for politicians at home, in home countries who may be Eurosceptics or actively anti-EU, depending on their stances, to spread misinformation or to twist facts around because of the perceived distance between Brussels and Strasbourg and the other member states. And we saw this with some of the campaigns in Brexit, where they were able to sort of spin these false numbers and spin these stories in a misinformed light, and people were inclined to believe them. Voter turnout is also consistently low in EU elections and has been for the past few years because EU elections are frequently viewed as secondary elections among the citizens of the countries, meaning that people don't necessarily feel it's important or feel that it's a civic duty to vote in these elections, especially because they don't understand what they're voting for, because no one has actually told them what these different governmental bodies are and who contributes to which parts of it. Which means that in a lot of cases, the EU isn't actually as democratic as it could be because people aren't necessarily focusing on what they do and they don't necessarily understand what's going on. Yeah, go ahead. I'll take the POI.
So if you're highlighting the kind of, I suppose, democratic deficits in the EU, aren't those deficits you're talking about actually based upon national educational curriculums and the national media as opposed to the EU itself?
You could perceive that as one angle, and that is a part of it. But a lot of ordinary people on the ground would feel quite distant from the sort of news sources that are Brussels and Strasbourg, which are the main two parliamentary houses of the EU. And that makes it very easy for people to feel distant from it. And there aren't that many resources for reaching out to the EU. You have to go through a lot of sort of old-fashioned websites, and then you're not sure exactly what you're looking for. Speaking from experience, having done projects involving these figures and things like that, I found it was quite difficult for me to find the resources I needed because I wasn't sure where I was going or which governmental body to look at. And there was nothing to really help me with that. There was nothing to really explain what each different source did and who I should be looking for various tools. And I think that's what I'm highlighting as well, is that we need a lot more transparency with regard to these things. Secondly, there have also been recent divides between member states, especially between the North and the South and between the East and the West on issues such as currencies, which have allowed right-wing and populist parties to kind of grow and gain traction because people are finding differences in economic policies, differences in cultural aspects, and there's not as much unity between the member states. There isn't as much willingness to understand the other side. And the fact that only 19 member states officially have the euro, and there are a few who have unofficially adopted it due to neighboring countries or who've been granted permission to print the euro as their currency, means that the EU doesn't actually have a centrally regulated bank or currency that can manage different rates of economic inflation, of other issues, of unemployment, things like that, because not every country has the same currency. Not to mention that all the economies within the EU have wildly different imports and exports, which makes regulating prices and regulating the sort of competition between different member states and the competition between the EU as an entity and the other trading blocs abroad makes it quite difficult, because it's difficult to regulate prices when your member states have such vastly different exports and imports. There's also the recent crises among various member states, especially stemming from the refugee crisis. And I'm not saying that member states shouldn't have taken in refugees when they needed it. I think humanitarian efforts are really important, and I think the EU should act as a single entity in that regard. But I think the fact that there was so much pressure on those border states, so much pressure on Greece, on Italy, on France and Germany underneath to kind of take these people in, and then there wasn't go ahead.
Yeah, don't you think it would have been worse without the EU, because it encouraged member states to take in refugees, whereas without this institution, there would have been no pressure on other member states to take any refugees at all?
I think that the EU's effort was well intentioned, but it could have been organized a lot better, and there could have been a lot more assistance given to those states, in particular the border states down south near the Mediterranean, that were flooded and swamped with so many numbers that they just couldn't handle it. And so they had to implement border checks and border controls that actually led to worsened humanitarian conditions and led to overcrowding in a lot of cases. So while the EU's effort was well intentioned, it kind of failed to consider the big issues that these southern border states would face. And as a result of that, there was kind of a lot of sort of fostering feelings about being abandoned, and about how the central governmental force doesn't necessarily understand what was going on. And we can see this not just in issues of the refugee crisis and things like that, but also in cultural issues where, speaking from experience, you have places like the Baltics, like Lithuania, they may be very enthusiastically EU, but they are still quite nationalistic. There's a sentiment there about being the best, about having the most prominent EU figures, which kind of goes against the spirit of the EU, which is that it should be all united under one bubble. And as a result of that, as a result of those cultural divides, the lack of clarity, the bureaucratic bloating, I say the European project has failed, and it should be reformed. The European project has failed, it should be reformed. As a result of that, I beg you to propose the motion. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. I shall now call upon Alessia Chocanea to make the case for the proposition. Opposition?
Thank you for the introduction. I will be introducing as the last speaker the opposition. So I'm going to begin my speech with a bit of rebuttal, first to Adam's speech and then to the second speech that we just heard, before launching into my substantive case, which will largely be in accordance with what our first speaker told us from opposition, and we'll add some kind of contextualization and a few other points. So let's begin with Adam's speech. Now, Adam told us that the main goal of the EU project was something like the United States of Europe, and how that has failed, and also how it's failed on peace. Now, I think my first speaker did a very good job of outlining how the EU definitely has not failed on peace. I'd like a more updated metric of peace. The EU has done very, very well. There have been no trade wars at all in the EU, despite that happening in the rest of the world, and that's because of the single market. And also, the EU protects members from trade wars globally because it gives member states more clout in negotiations. That's one thing. Going back to actual peace, I'd like to remind you that post-1990s, the EU played a major role in the peace process and state building process in the Balkan region in the aftermath of the Balkan War. So that's in 1998 Good Friday Agreement. Who was it that brought peace to Northern Ireland? It was Europe. So I think that whole point is just very much moot, basically. I think in terms, if the first proposition has defined this debate as you win if you can prove that the EU has managed to bring peace to Europe, then we very much win on that metric. Right, moving on. So what else have we been told? We've then been told that the EU harms Eastern Europe. Now, I am an Eastern European myself, and I loved this argument because it is very much false. The arguments that Adam gave were about, Germany giving high interest loans to Bulgaria or whatever. Now, that is just absurd. Like, I've seen the investment that Germany has done in Bulgaria. It is very much a boon for the economy. It has led to vast amounts of jobs. It very much replaces investment that cannot happen in Bulgaria from the state or from private entities, right? So in that sense, it is very much a positive for Eastern European countries. I myself come from Romania. Romania has developed massively with European investment, both from the EU state through the EU budget, but also from private entities that are now investing in our economy. These things have in no way harmed the economy. They've replaced much needed resources that there would have been no other way in which to replace. So I think from that perspective, that whole argument is a bit absurd. He then goes on to talk about the issue with Greece. Now, I think the euro is possibly the biggest problem that Europe has faced. It very much has some structural issues. It has a lot of problems. It has led to a lot of hardship in Greece. My issue with that argument, though, is that it very much ignores that the euro is very much a separate entity from the European Union as a whole. So while we may admit that maybe the euro wasn't that thought through, maybe it was too bureaucratic in its approach, maybe it doesn't cover every single country, ultimately, it is a separate entity from the European project as a whole, right? We're mostly interested in the European Union, and there's no way to say that that has been a failure. Even if you think that the euro maybe has been. What else was added? Right. I think another big point that was brought up by Adam was the fact that the European Commission is probably a problem. Now, I really disagree with his characterization of the Commission. He said, well, the Commission isn't directly elected, therefore it must be a problem. Now, I'd like to remind everyone that the reason it isn't directly elected is because it's meant to be politically neutral. It's meant to provide a counterbalance to the European Parliament that is directly elected, and the European Council, which holds heads of member states. And I'd like to remind everyone also, the European Commission has absolutely no power to implement anything without approval from the Parliament and the Council, both of which hold elected. I would argue it is. I think a little nuance is needed here, though. It is definitely not democratic when measured against a state. It is definitely not as democratic as, say, Germany or maybe France. But the issue here is that the EU isn't a state. It's more an international organization. And when it's compared to other international organizations, you actually realize that it is very much a lot more democratic than, for example, the UN, a lot more democratic than NATO, a lot more democratic than other large international organizations. And yeah, I think that kind of deals with all of that point. Now, the other part of the democratic deficit that was brought up, especially in the second speech from the proposition, is the fact that there is very much disengagement among voters. Now, I'd like to do two things here. One, I'd like to mitigate the argument about political disengagement from people. And the reason I want to do that is because I think this is very much case by case a thing, right? Like, I think some countries, yes, there's a lot of disengagement, but other countries, there's a lot of awareness of the good that the EU does. I'd like to again mention Eastern European states where the vast majority of people, up to like 70 to 80% of voters, support the European Union. I think it's doing a lot. And other countries like Germany, which has historically had approval rates around the 60s and 70s as well. So very much disengagement, I think, afflicts a few countries that are member states. So that's a mitigation point. But the other point is just the fact that, as the speaker explained, this is very much a large, complex organization. I think a bit of political disengagement is inevitable, and it's just related to the structure of the organization. I don't think that counts against it per se. I think there are many ways to deal with that. Like I know there are panels everywhere saying this is EU investment from the EU budget. We have Erasmus that allows students to travel from one country to another, again sponsored by the EU budget. Like I don't think that insufficient marketing makes for a failed project. I think we can definitely do more on the marketing side of the EU, but that is not a point against it per se. All right, what we have heard from the prop, I'll take your POI in a sec. The answer I was given to the POI that I asked was, the effort could have been organized better in relation to the refugee crisis. 100% agreed. I think that is true of most things that happen in this life. Most things could have been organized better, but I think it is just the fact that in most areas, having the EU is better than not having it. Refugee crisis is the best example of that. I was actually going to use it as part of my substantive points. Having a EU-wide coordinated response where countries were forced to take in refugees meant that 1 million people ended up going to Germany and countless more ended up going to Sweden and the rest of Europe. All of these people would have otherwise been stuck at those very borders that the speaker was lamenting, right? All of these people would have just contributed to even more hardship for Greece and Italy, etc. So the fact that we have the EU meant that the situation is better. I think there is no better proof that the EU is not a failed project, but a necessary and highly successful one. It does not have to be perfect. It just has to work. Even if it works 60%, 60% is better than 0. I'll take your POI now.
Hi, yeah. So you spoke a bit about the budget and about how Eastern European projects are funded and everything like that. But there's already been investigations done where those budgets and those grants are being given out. It's massively fueled by cronyism, whereby like the best friends of the Hungary Prime Minister essentially gets a massive grant, a farming subsidies, that sort of thing. So clearly it's not actually helping people who are most vulnerable if it's just ending up in the pockets of cronies.
So I think that's a mischaracterization, right? So what's happening is that a lot of EU money is going to East. So obviously, yes, it is true that maybe there will be some cronyism. Maybe some of those funds will go to the best friend of the Hungarian Prime Minister, but that would have happened regardless. If you didn't have money coming from the EU, which by the way is better regulated than the money that the Hungarian government gets from its people, if you didn't have that, you would have all Hungarian money going to these things, right? Like my point is, Romania is the best example of this. Most of the time that is also going to meaningful projects, and the reason for that is because EU oversight means that you cannot be as corrupt as usual. Right, I think I've dealt with that. So what I wanted to talk about basically are the advantages of the EU and talking again about, I want to prove that on balance it has done more good than harm. Advantages of the market and internal free trade have, according to some studies, added up to 9% to the EU GDP, even though that hasn't been heterogeneous among countries, right? So I think that is a massive economic boost. 2, it has given member states negotiating clout on a world stage. It is just a fact that a single member state, such as the Czech Republic, cannot stand up to China. But when it is part of the EU, it can. Thirdly, it has contributed to the convergence of the East and the West by bringing former countries from the under the Iron Curtain to the fold and encouraging them to develop alongside Western countries. And fourthly, it has contributed to the rights of citizens by improving economic and social mobility and just by giving more freedom to every single European citizen. Therefore, I beg you to oppose.
Clap, clap, clap to everybody. Thanks for all the contributions. So I'm now going to put the question to the House. So the motion is to remind you that this House believes that the European project has failed. I believe we're going to have a poll now, and all of those in favor should vote aye or yes, and all of those against should vote nay or no. So you should be able to see the poll there in front of you.
So just a couple more seconds if you haven't voted yet.
Has everyone voted?
Okay.
Ah, we have some results. Okay. Well, the results seem fairly decisive. We have 84% nay and 16% aye, which means the motion is defeated. Okay, so well done to the opposition side. I understand I now have the opportunity to make an address. So just first of all, thanks to all of the contributors for making your speeches. I thought they were all great, and it's lovely to hear people engaging with the question of the debate, which I think is a valid one that's worth reasoned debates based on facts and, you know, good, well-informed arguments. It's also refreshing to be participating in the debate over Zoom. Obviously, everyone's lives have kind of been upended by this historical moment, and it's terrific to, well done to the organisers for continuing college society life in this creative way that brings people together and, you know, allows people to continue their college experience despite the restrictions that you're living under. So well done for that. So I'll just go through a couple of notes that I made when I was hearing the speeches. Maybe I can give as a bit of context, I can just tell you what my job is. So I'm the Europe correspondent for the Irish Times, which means that day to day I cover the affairs of the EU for Irish readers. Yeah, it's a really interesting job, and it's a really interesting time to be doing it, which I'll discuss a little bit later. So just first of all, we had Adam Mellis. And Adam quite cunningly structured his argument by carefully defining what we would consider to be success and failure, which of course makes an argument easier to make. So he knows what he's doing, obviously. Then you defined the aims of the EU as being peace, prosperity, and democracy. I did note sometimes during your address, you made some references to claims which I didn't think were proven. So, for example, you described it as a bloated organization. I think Alessia made a reference to this, also to the exploitation of Eastern European states. I'm not sure if those claims were proven in your speech, though you did make them. Also, it was an interesting point to speak about the percentage of wealth that the EU represents in the world, and it having shrunk. Of course, I think it is debatable whether that is in fact not just to do with the rest of the world growing. Yeah, I think the other thing that I noticed was that a lot of this debate was not just in Adam's address, but throughout the addresses, it was often based on addressing the challenges of the past, particularly the Eurozone crisis of the last decade. But there may, in fact, be interesting questions to interrogate in the current moment, which about what the EU is doing and how it's doing it, which I think it could be relevant for those interested in the subject. So yeah, that was then Sean Gordon Dalton had a bit on Brexit. Now it's irresistible to do a bit of UK bashing, particularly I think in the current moment, relevant to the particular motion in hand or not. So it was interesting, I think, that your point that the crisis in the EU is characterized by some people taking advantage and other people not taking advantage. And your argument that ever closer union will help the problems of the euro. That is something that I think some people do believe. They think the solution is more Europe, and that's something there's concrete steps towards actually at the moment, which we might be able to discuss. Then you argued that yes, it was exactly the setting aside of petty national issues that made the EU successful. This is what has made the EU successful. and you mentioned living standards and the Green New Deal and the advantage of not having the City of London anymore to make arguments about taxes, which is interesting. And I liked that you brought it into the current moment by saying that COVID-19 showed how the EU can come together. However, I think we can possibly discuss this a little bit, but the ways in which the EU has addressed the pandemic, I think it's been a mixed bag. In some ways it has successfully confronted it, but in other ways it's also shown the limits of its power, which is of course something that member states have designed. It's the member states grant the power that the EU has. So if it doesn't have the power to address something, it's a choice the member states have made. And I liked your characterization of the EU as well-intended but clumsy, with some successes and failures. I think both sides, all the speakers who acknowledged the weaknesses and strengths of the argument, strengthened their own argument by doing so, if you know what I mean. So then we had Alva. You went into some of how you found the treaties complex and also the overlapping, the fact that not all member states participate in all parts of the EU. So we have some that are in Schengen and some that are not, and some that aren't member states that are part of Schengen and so on. I was interested to your reference of smaller EU member states signing FTAs with each other, which is a bit strange because I don't think that fits within the single market. And then, of course, you had the valid point about the accessibility of EU information. Of course, as a body, it produces a massive amount of data, which could, be much made more accessible as a resource. I think it's just, if you're trying to deal with the Commission's website, there's an amazing amount of stuff on there, but it is a question about how easy it is to find. If you are looking for news about the EU, you don't have to go to news organizations in Brussels or Strasbourg. You can check out the Irish Times, where I have my reporting every day. And I thought it was interesting that you said there was too much diversity among the member states. I think this kind of made it incoherent, and in a way, this complexity was a weakness. Including, you mentioned the different import and export profiles of different member states, potentially making coherent policy more difficult. This is, I think, a really interesting point, and it's worth asking the question: to what extent is diversity a strength, and to what extent is it a challenge? And I think it's all about how policy is designed, right? You can have a policy that in which diversity becomes a strength or it becomes a problem. And then I liked the little discussion that we got into about assistance to Mediterranean states and the problem during the time when, particularly up to 2016, when so many people were arriving over the sea and the border states had to bear the disproportionate burden. I think that is one of the major challenges that's facing the EU, because they had several years of reprieve from having to deal with they bought several years of reprieve of having to deal with that issue by signing an agreement with Turkey. And during the time that they bought, they failed to come to an agreement about how to jointly process migration. And the effect is that it's managed on a kind of a permanent emergency basis, which is why we have people living in the open air on the Greek islands in their thousands. Okay, and then we had Alessia. I really liked the perspective that Alessia brought from Eastern Europe. I thought it was great how you were able to respond to the point of information and say, well, actually, I'm your Eastern European, and kind of give your point of view there. You mentioned you were willing to concede a structural problem with the euro, but then said, well, it's different to the EU, the euro. It's a separate project. It's true that not every member state has the euro, but I think if the designers of the euro had their way, they would. Do you know what I mean? I think that was supposed to be the idea of it. And then you mentioned that the Commission is supposed to be politically neutral. It's an interesting one. There are kind of people who have different views on that. Some people, at the moment, the Commission is being quite political, and it's always a bit contentious. it's not quite a neutral civil service. You know, it's something more than that, and it can throw its weight around. And then you made the point that insufficient marketing does not mean that a project has failed, and I think that is it is important. But then again, you know, if you are a political power institution, part of your abilities, I suppose, your is being able to communicate your worth, isn't it? So that is an important thing. And I think it was a zinger when you said that the EU oversight means you cannot be as corrupt as usual. That's what I'm going to remember now when we're talking about corruption in Bulgaria and other European states. So yeah, that. Well done to everybody. I thought the addresses were all great. So yeah, a couple of points I just wanted to kind of bring out. The first one is about the current developments in the EU, which have come about in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic. Really, I think it would have been quite relevant to deal with that overall in the debate, because there's probably arguments you could have taken on both sides could have taken on it. So basically, what the EU has agreed is to jointly borrow 750 billion euro and use that money. They're going to borrow it on the open capital markets and use it to counter-cyclically invest in member state economies along the strategic investment lines that it has of digitalizing the continent and also going towards the target of carbon neutrality by 2050. And this agreement to jointly borrow in order to spend is viewed as a kind of landmark step in the history of the EU. Some people called it a Hamiltonian moment. Others said it's not quite a Hamiltonian moment. It's not like we're setting up a finance ministry of the EU or anything, but you know, it is viewed as a landmark step towards that. And then some people view that as also going some way to resolve some of the structural flaws in the euro, which I think are quite widely acknowledged at this stage. The other interesting point is that Euroscepticism, there was a couple of references by different people about rising Euroscepticism and, you know, rising Eurosceptic parties. The picture is rather complex. So the first thing is that Euroscepticism isn't a monolithic force across the continent. Basically, policies and attitudes towards the EU vary from member state, and the ways in which some parties are Eurosceptic are unique, or nationally unique. So Dutch Eurosceptics want a cheaper EU. They want to keep their Dutch dollars or Dutch euros, you know, in their pockets. And they've got big problems with perceived corruption in Eastern Europe, and they've got big problems with migration. Whereas Italian Eurosceptics kind of want more Europe, so they want more spending, they want more help. And that means that the Eurosceptic forces, say, of Italy and the Netherlands, just to take an example, they want diametrically opposite things. With the Italians wanting more help, more money, and the Dutch Eurosceptics always wanting less Europe. So you could argue that Italian Eurosceptics are more like disappointed Europhiles than what we would associate with Euroscepticism particularly in the English-speaking part of Europe, because we usually look at like UKIP and that kind of thing as our kind of frame of reference for Euroscepticism. So yeah, be aware of that. It also means it's difficult for pro-European forces to broadly satisfy everyone who has issues with the EU. But also it means that it's not that there's this pan-continental unstoppable force or wave that's all pursuing one aim that's coming, which is sometimes the impression that you get. And there's sometimes a narrative that's sort of told that, there was Brexit, next it's going to be Le Pen, then it's going to be Nexit, or, like that this is sort of a drumbeat of one movement that's going to inexorably succeed. It's not quite the case. And also, of course, Brexit has had some quite interesting, perhaps unforeseen consequences in that it actually mass educated people about what the EU was actually for, because there was all these debates about, the Brexit debate was like a long rehearsal about what the EU is, including for people in the UK. and what membership actually meant. And the effect that we've seen in polls is that, well, for example, in the Netherlands, support for outright leaving the EU in the aftermath of Brexit really plunged. And then in Italy, where Italy is often viewed as like the next big risk for Euroscepticism, it's really a complex picture. Essentially, you have a right wing that has Eurosceptic tendencies that is basically being pretty much always at the same levels, always about 40% of the population lean right, and that's just steady. The parties that hold different bits of that 40% between them change, but the views of the public seem almost, unchanging, irrespective of that. And the demands of Eurosceptics in Italy change. So sometimes they say, we want to leave the EU, but that's pretty rare. And they haven't really said that since Brexit. So now they say things like, they don't even say we want to leave the euro anymore, really. They come up with other suggestions, like we want to launch a parallel currency beside the euro, things like that. So they kind of know that they have to come up with these other arguments, because, the kind of Brexit ideologically based, but not really factually rigorous political aim has been exposed really for being that. And yeah, so that's caused a problem for Eurosceptic parties. They can't make as simplistic arguments as they used to. So I mentioned migration, the lack of resolution, and that's a major issue facing the EU. Then was one thing that I would encourage you to do if you are facing this issue again, is to not just focus on the Commission and the Parliament, but really look at the role of national leaders in the European Council, because the European Council, in which all the national prime ministers, the likes of prime ministers and so on, meet, is extremely powerful. Nothing can happen without it. The Commission proposes legislation, but it has to have the support of the Council. It can propose all it likes, but it's not going to go anywhere unless the national leaders support it. And I think often the influence of national leaders is they're let away with it. They're let away without the scrutiny in regards to EU policy that they deserve. When we get bad or sort of clumsy, patched together agreements at EU level, it's usually because there's been different national priorities, and a cobbled together solution to try and please everybody has been put together, which means that you've ended up somewhere where you would never have intended to if you wanted to design something that works. So a lot of that is to do with national leaders and their priorities, which is fair enough, but sometimes there's a cynicism in the way the politics of that is handled, where national leaders claim everything bad is Europe and everything good is their work. So anyway, have a look at the European Council. And then just another one, which I just quickly looked up. More than one person mentioned bloated institution or something like that, over like the EU was a bloated institution. Be careful of things like this. There's a few canards that have sort of entered, how can I say, like common knowledge, particularly in the wake of Brexit, that aren't necessarily based in fact. So the first question is like, what are we actually referring to when we're talking about like the EU? Which institution are we referring to? And if we're talking about the European Commission, as in like the civil service side of things, just to compare the size of the European Commission, it has 32,000 employees. Sounds like a lot, but compared to the civil service in England, so the European Commission serves like 500 million people with 32,000. The civil service in England is 332,000. So it's 10 times the size, despite only serving the population of England. So the bloated institution thing is something that we shouldn't accept without properly defining what we're talking about and making the case for it, because I do think it's subject to challenge. So that's all. Those are the points that occurred to me. I don't know if that's what a chair usually does, but thanks very much for inviting me. Congratulations to everyone and well done on your speeches. Now what do? I'll look at the script again. I would like to call upon the auditor to announce the Society's forthcoming events.
Hi, thank you so much for a really great auditor's address. A lot of really interesting points. Thank you so much. And I'd like to thank also all the speakers as well, and to everyone who's watching online. Very exciting. So just in terms of our upcoming events, we have 2 more pre-term debates that are happening online virtually. Oh, cool. Those are happening next Friday and then Wednesday week. So next Friday, we're doing a comedy debate in basically collaboration with Trinity College and the International Students Office, I think. And then the week after, we are running our annual TAP orientation debate. So it should be very interesting debates. And if you'd like to get involved, please get in touch with Maggie Larson, our wonderful correspondence secretary. As to what other events we're going to be running this year, because I'm sure everyone's wondering, how are you dealing with COVID? We are dealing with it, I can guarantee you that. We have a full slate planned for Freshers Week, regardless of whether or not we are allowed to hold events physically or we have to hold it all online. We're going to aim to have a hybrid approach, but in general, like we're ready for anything. I can guarantee you that. So again, we have online debate trainings happening next term. We have online school competitions happening. So if you want to get some experience judging and you want to feel nice and help kids out, definitely do our school competitions. Or if you want to start debating, we have our maidens competition that will also be happening. And yeah, like we will be updating our members about this on our website, tcdhist.com, or on our Facebook page, as well as our Instagram. And we also have a Discord page. Woo! Basically any channel you can think of, we probably have it, except for TikTok. That's gonna have to wait. And I'd also like to draw your attention to, we just today post an interest form for our anti-racism working group. So we're establishing an anti-racism working group. This is open to basically anyone who wants to advocate for ethnic and racial minorities in the society. They'll be directing our strategy moving forward, as well as basically like the mandate for this group is kind of flexible. We're really looking for input from anyone and everyone. So even if you feel like you're new to the society and you're not entirely sure of what to say, get involved. Seriously, we want to hear every type of perspective. I also would like to, that form is on our website as well as our Facebook page. And I'd also like to draw your attention to our suggestion box as well. So if you have any suggestions for maybe how to run future virtual events or how to run a virtual reception. Usually we have a nice wine and cheese reception after our debates, and unfortunately we can't do that with virtual Zoom events. But maybe there's some other way that we could have a fun time and continue the Discord. So yeah, that's all available on our website. Please check it out. And yeah, I don't think there's anything else I need to mention about upcoming events. So I'll secede back to the chair, who will close the debate.
Okay, I call this house adjourned. Thanks, everyone.
Great. I just want to say thank you to our excellent chair, Naomi O'Leary, and to Edinburgh for coming to our virtual corresponding debate and also first virtual debate, and also to everyone who came to watch. Yeah, thank you all so much for coming. Eventually we'll have a reception afterwards again, but for now, maybe cheese itself at home. Okay, thank you for coming, and I will end the webinar.